The British Museum's Department of the Middle East houses over 130,000 ununiform tablets. Most sit in storage, catalogued, but rarely examined. In 2009, a researcher working through previously photographed materials noticed something unusual about a cluster of tablets from the Cuneiform collection, fragments excavated from Nineveh in the 1850s that had been hastily catalogued and shelved. One fragment in particular carried a passage that didn't match any known composition. The text was in Adian, dated to roughly the 7th century BCE, but describing much older events. The fragment was small, perhaps 4 in across, with only 11 lines of readable text. But those 11 lines contained a phrase that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian literature: when the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki. Not war against demons, not war against primordial chaos, war upon themselves. The fragment goes on to describe weapons that burned without flame and left the earth poisoned for 3 harvests. It mentions a city, possibly Shurabak, where no birds sang for 40 years after the fire fell from heaven, and then the fragment breaks off, the rest lost to time, or still buried in unexamined storage somewhere in the museum's vast holdings. This isn't an isolated anomaly. Across dozens of Sumerian and Akkadian tablets scattered across museums from Philadelphia to Paris to Baghdad, a pattern emerges when you line up the texts, chronologically and geographically. References to conflicts between factions of gods, divine councils splintering, territories divided, weapons deployed, cities destroyed, and finally around 2000 BCE, a series of lamentation texts describing catastrophic destruction that ended the Sumerian world. What if these weren't separate myths? What if they were fragments of a single coherent historical record documentation of a prolonged conflict that reached its devastating conclusion in what the texts themselves might call the Anunnaki's final war? If you're settling in to explore this with me, whether you're lying in bed in Bangkok, sitting in your car in Chicago, or walking through the quiet streets of Copenhagen at 3 a.m., then leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. There's something powerful about knowing we're all following this mystery together across time zones and continents. This investigation will take us deep into the oldest written records humanity possesses. We'll examine what the tablets actually say. We'll look at what mainstream scholarship explains away. And we'll ask a question that might reshape how we understand the birth of civilization. What if the Sumerians weren't creating mythology, but preserving memory of events they witnessed before the waters rose? To understand what the tablets describe, we first need to understand who wrote them and why their perspective matters. Sumer emerged in southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in the region where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow toward the Persian Gulf. The land is flat, hot, and marshy. It floods seasonally. It has almost no stone, no timber, no metal, or by all geological measures, it's a difficult place to build a civilization. Yet around 4000 BCE, something extraordinary happened. Villages became cities. Cities became city-states with walls, temples, irrigation systems, and administrative bureaucracies. By 3200 BCE, the Sumerians had developed the world's first writing system. Not pictographs, not simple accounting marks, but a fully functional script capable of recording complex grammar, poetry, legal codes, and historical narratives. This wasn't a gradual evolution. The archaeological record shows a relatively sudden leap from basic settlements to sophisticated urban centers with advanced engineering and organizational systems. Mainstream scholarship attributes this to agricultural surplus, enabling specialization. But the Sumerians themselves offered a different explanation. They said they were taught. The word Anunnaki appears throughout Sumerian texts. The term translates approximately as those who from heaven to earth came, or princely offspring of, and referring to an Anu, the sky god. Early Sumerian literature describes the Anunnaki as a group of deities. The exact number varies by text, sometimes 7, sometimes 50, sometimes 300, who descended to earth and established the first cities. These weren't abstract spiritual beings. The text described them with physical bodies, families, appetites, political hierarchies, and territorial disputes. They assigned roles. Enki governed Eridu and the waters beneath the earth. Enlil ruled Nepa and controlled storms and agriculture. Nana oversaw Ur. Inanna held Ur. Each major Sumerian city had a patron deity who physically resided there, maintained a household, and required service from human workers. The earliest cities, Eridu, Bad, Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shurapak, are not legends. Archaeological excavations have confirmed their existence and dates. Eridu's temple precinct shows continuous occupation and rebuilding spanning over 3,000 years. The foundations go down through multiple construction phases, each built directly atop the last, suggesting unbroken ritual importance for the site. The Sumerian King List, a document reconstructed from multiple clay tablet copies, the most complete being the Weld-Blondel prism, held at Oxford's Asholean Museum, provides a chronological framework. The list begins with a phrase after kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Eridu. It then names 8 kings who ruled 5 cities before the flood. Their reigns are measured in sars. AR equals 3,600 years, giving individual rulers impossibly long reigns of 28,800 years or 40,200 years. Mainstream scholarship interprets these numbers as either mathematical encoding, scribal errors, or symbolic representations of legitimacy rather than literal years. The argument holds weight. No biological organism could live 40,000 years, but the King List itself treats these figures as straightforward data. It doesn't frame them as mythology. It lists them alongside post-blood kings with normal human lifespans in the same matter-of-fact administrative style. More curious still is what happens after the flood entry. The King List states simply, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The post-flood kings have much shorter reigns, still extraordinary by modern standards, with some ruling 300 or 400 years, but nothing approaching the antediluvian spans. The text offers no explanation for this change. It merely records it. The flood itself marks a hard chronological boundary in Sumerian historical consciousness. Everything divides into 2 eras, before the flood and after the flood. This isn't unique to Sumaf. Flood traditions appear across Mesopotamian cultures from the Akkadian Artras's epic to the Babylonian Gilgamesh cycle. But the Sumerian accounts are the oldest written versions, and they contain details the later adaptations omit or soften. The discovery of these texts happened almost by accident. In 1849, British archaeologist Austin Henry Leard began excavating the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital. He uncovered the library of Ashurbanipal, containing over 30,000 clay tablets. Among them was a tablet that, when translated in 1872 by George Smith, described a global flood nearly identical to the biblical account, but predating it by over 1,000 years. The discovery caused immediate controversy. Further excavations, throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries at Nippuruk, Lagash, and dozens of other sites unearthed hundreds of thousands of additional tablets. The University of Pennsylvania conducted extensive digs at Nippur between 1889 and 1900, recovering approximately 50,000 tablets and fragments. Among these were the earliest Sumerian flood narratives, including the Eridu Genesis fragment, now catalogued as CBS 10673. Deciphering ununiform required decades of comparative work. The script uses wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, with each sign potentially representing a sound, a word, or a conceptual category, depending on context. Sumerian is a language isolate with no known relatives, making translation especially challenging. Early scholars had to work backward from later Urdian bilingual texts, slowly building vocabulary lists and grammar rules. What emerged from this translation work was startling. The Sumerians didn't write mythology in the way we typically understand the term. Their texts read more like administrative records, legal documents, and engineering manuals that happen to feature gods as the primary actors. They describe procedures, measurements, architectural specifications, and irrigation techniques, alongside divine genealogy and cosmic conflicts. Consider the Eridu Genesis, the earliest flood narrative. The surviving portion begins not with creation, but with an already functioning world. Cities exist, humans work the fields, kingship has been established. The gods are introduced not as cosmic abstractions, but as administrators dealing with a practical problem. The text is frustratingly matter-of-fact, given the enormity of what it describes. This documentary quality appears throughout Sumerian literature. The Lament for describes the destruction of Ur around 2000 CE, with specific architectural details: which gates fell first, which neighborhoods burned, where refugees fled. The Curse of Agadi catalogues the systematic destruction of Akkad after Naramin's offense against the Temple of En, listing economic collapse, infrastructure failure, and environmental devastation with bureaucratic precision. The tablets themselves are survival miracles. Clay is both durable and fragile. If kept dry, a baked clay tablet can last indefinitely, but moisture, salt, or physical stress can reduce it to mud. Many tablets were deliberately baked after inscription. Others were accidentally fired when the buildings housing them burned, ironically preserving them through catastrophe. The texts we have represent a tiny fraction of what once existed. For every surviving tablet, dozens or hundreds were lost to time, looting, or environmental decay. What survives, however, is enough to reconstruct major narratives and identify recurring patterns. And one pattern that appears repeatedly across different compositions from different time periods is conflict among the Anunnaki themselves. The texts describe a hierarchy. At the top sits An or Anu, the distant sky father who reigns but rarely intervenes. Beneath him authority divides primarily between two half-brothers, Enlil, the lord of air and storms, and Enki, also called A, the lord of wisdom and subterranean waters. These two are not aligned. They disagree on policy. They compete for influence. They champion different factions, and in multiple texts, they take opposite sides in crucial decisions, most notably, the decision to destroy humanity. Below, Eno and Enki sit numerous other Anunnaki, each with defined roles and territories. Ninurta, Enlil's son, functions as the divine warrior. Inanna, also called Ishtar, governs love, war, and Uruk, but frequently overreaches her authority. Nana governs the moon, and Uruk. Utu governs the sun, and justice. Ishgagal rules the underworld realm separate from, and sometimes in opposition to the surface-dwelling gods. This isn't a unified pantheon working in harmony. It's a complex political structure with competing interests, territorial boundaries, and recurring power struggles. And according to the texts, this structure eventually fractured under the weight of its own internal contradictions. But before we examine the war itself, we need to understand what triggered it. We need to look at what the texts identify as the moment everything began to unravel: the divine assembly that condemned humanity, and the God who refused to comply. The assembly that condemned mankind. The fragment preserved as CBS 1063, housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, begins in the middle of the story. The first portion is lost. When the text becomes readable, cities already exist, and kings already rule. The tablet names 5 antediluvian cities: Eridur, Badibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. It describes kingship descending from heaven and names specific rulers, though their names are partially damaged in the surviving text. Then the narrative shifts. The tone changes from administrative record to dramatic dialogue. The text describes An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhurag, the senior members of the Anunnaki Council, making a decision. The tablet is fragmentary here, but the sequence is clear. The gods discuss a problem, a solution is proposed, and action is authorized. The problem, according to the fuller account preserved in later Adian versions, like Beta Trahesis epic, is humanity itself, specifically the noise humanity makes. The Akkadian word used is rigmu, which translates as noise, clamor, or uproar. The text describe humanity multiplying across the earth. Cities grow, fields expand, and the constant activity. The grinding of grain, the hammering of copper, the voices of thousands of people conducting daily life disturbs the gods. In the Atrasis epic, the complaint is explicit. Enlil, sleepless and irritated, brings the matter before the divine council. The noise of mankind has become too intense. I am losing sleep over their racket. The solution he proposes escalates over several attempts. First plague, then drought, then famine. Each time humanity recovers. Finally, Enlil proposes the ultimate solution, a flood that will erase everything. Council agrees. The decision is formalized. Instructions are given to Enki, who governs the subterranean waters, to release the abyss. The storm god will open the heavens. The earth will be caught between above and below, drowned completely. But Enki objects. This is not a small detail. This is a fracture at the highest level of authority. Enki doesn't merely express disagreement. He directly contravenes the council's decision. He cannot stop the flood. The authority for that action has been granted and the mechanism set in motion, but he can undermine it. The Erodonasis describes what happens next with careful specificity. Enki approaches a reed wall, not a person, but a wall. Speaking to the wall, he reveals the god's plan within earshot of Zudra, a king of Shurupak, and a priest devoted to Enki. The text preserves Enki's instructions: tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save life. The boat you will build, its dimensions shall be equal, its length and width shall be the same. This is procedural information, engineering specifications. The text doesn't explain why Enki chooses to save Zudra specifically. It doesn't detail Enki's motivations beyond the implicit. He disagrees with genocide. The fuller Atrahasis version expands the context. In that telling, humanity's creation had been Enki's project. The younger gods, called the Yi, had been performing agricultural labor for the Anunnaki, digging canals and irrigation channels. The work was brutal. After what the text describes as 40 years of exhausting toil, the Agi revolted. They burned their tools, surrounded Enlil's house, and demanded relief. The crisis could have escalated into divine civil war. Instead, the council reached a solution: create a new class of workers, mix clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god, specifically Waila, identified as the instigator of the Ig revolt, and fashion a hybrid creature capable of labor but lacking divine power. These would be humans. Enki designed them. The goddess Ninu, also called Ninhorag or Ninmah, assisted in their creation. The text describes the process in language that reads unsettlingly like genetic engineering. Divine essence combined with earthly material to produce something new. 14 clay figures, 7 male, 7 female, were brought to life. From these, humanity multiplied. So when the council votes to destroy humanity, they are voting to destroy Enki's creation, his solution to the Igi crisis, his handiwork. The texts don't psychologize Enki's emotions. Ancient Mesopotamian literature rarely dwells on internal states, but the implication is clear. He has a stake in humanity's survival that Enlil does not. The flood comes. The Enridi Genesis describes it briefly. A storm rages for 7 days and nights. The Atrasis epic adds detail. The dikes of heaven are opened. The fountains of the abyss erupt. The surface of the earth vanishes beneath churning water. Even the gods are terrified by the destruction they've unleashed. The text describes Ninu weeping, regretting the decision, mourning the drowned humans like lost children. When the waters recede, Zusudra's boat comes to rest on a mountain. He emerges. He offers sacrifice. And here the accounts diverge in fascinating ways. In the Eridu Genesis, Ziusudra is rewarded with eternal life and taken to Dilmun, a paradise land. In the Atrahasis epic, the aftermath becomes a confrontation. Enlil arrives to inspect the cleaned earth and discovers survivors. He's enraged. Someone violated the council's decree. The text records his accusation. All of the people were to perish. How did any man survive? Enki's defiance is now exposed. What follows is not divine harmony restored. It's a tense negotiation. Enki argues that destroying all humanity was excessive. He advocates for more limited solutions. Natural predation, disease, barrenness in some women to control population growth. Enlil reluctantly accepts these terms, but the fundamental breach remains. The highest divine council made a unanimous decision, and one of its most powerful members directly sabotaged it. This is not how gods typically behave in mythology. Myths usually present divine will as unified, inscrutable, or allegorically instructive, but the Sumerian texts treat this as political history, a record of institutional breakdown at the highest level. The implications ripple forward. If the Anunnaki Council could fracture over humanity's fate, what else might divide them? If Enki could defy Enlil successfully, what prevented others from doing the same? If the flood was authorized by divine decree but undermined by divine dissent, what does that reveal about the stability of Anunnaki governance? The text suggests the answer. Nothing prevented further fractures. And other texts preserved across centuries and recovered from ruins, separated by hundreds of miles, describe exactly what you'd expect in the aftermath of such a foundational breach. Escalating conflicts over authority, territory, and the fundamental question of who holds ultimate power. The symbol of that power, according to multiple Mesopotamian compositions, was an object called the Tablet of Destinies, and that tablet would be stolen, recovered, and fought over repeatedly. Each theft representing not random chaos, but calculated moves in an ongoing struggle for control. The labor revolt that changed everything. To understand why the flood decision fractured the Anunnaki, we need to go back further to the problem that necessitated humanity's creation in the first place. The texts describe this with surprising clarity. The gods had a labor shortage, and it provoked the first open rebellion in their hierarchy. The Atrasis epic devotes its opening sections to this crisis. The composition begins not with creation but with an already functioning cosmic order. The Anunnaki have divided the universe into territories. The older gods, the Anunnaki proper, hold authority. Beneath them labor the younger gods, called the Igi. The text doesn't specify the exact relationship between these groups, but the hierarchy is clear. The Anunnaki command, the Agi obey. The Agi are assigned the hardest physical work, digging irrigation canals, dredging rivers, hauling earth to build embankments and reservoirs. This isn't symbolic labor. The Atrasis epic describes it with the specificity of someone who's actually done agricultural infrastructure work. The aching exhaustion, the mud, the relentless digging. The text states they labored for 40 years under these conditions. Then they broke. The Atrasis epic preserved the moment with dramatic detail. The Egi gathered at night. They burned their digging tools. They surrounded the house of Enlil, the overseer of their labor. The text uses the word siege. This wasn't a petition or protest, but an act of open rebellion that threatened to escalate into violence. Enlil responds by calling an emergency meeting of the senior Anunnaki. The scene reads like crisis management. Enlil is frightened. The text explicitly says so. He sends for Anu, the nominal king of the gods, and for Enki. The council convenes to address what amounts to a divine labor strike with revolutionary overtones. The Agi's representative, a god named Anu, not to be confused with the sky god, states their case. The labor is too heavy, the work is killing us, our distress is excessive, they demand relief, or they'll continue the rebellion. The Anunnaki face a genuine problem. They can't simply overpower the Igi. The younger gods are too numerous and organized. Violence could spiral into a civil war that might destabilize the entire cosmic order. But they also can't function without the agricultural labor the Ig provide. The irrigation systems on which Sumerian civilization depends require constant maintenance. Enki proposes the solution: create a new category of being to take over the labor, not gods, so they won't have divine power to rebel, but intelligent enough to follow instructions and capable enough to perform complex agricultural tasks. The council agrees. Humanity is authorized as a replacement workforce. The creation process itself is described in the Atrahasis epic and elaborated in another composition, Enki and Ninmah. The method involves mixing clay with something called the flesh and blood of a god, specifically the god Wailer, whom the text identifies as the instigator and leader of the Igi revolt. He's slaughtered. His essence is mixed with earthly clay. The goddess Ninu, sometimes called Ninhor, sometimes Ninmah, depending on the text, shapes the first humans from this mixture. The language here has troubled translators for a century. The Sumerian and Adigian terms used suggest biological processes: mixing, shaping, impregnation. The text describes Ninu fashioning 14 lumps of clay, 7 on each side. She then births them with the assistance of womb goddesses. The process is repeated to generate more humans. Whether this represents literal description, metaphorical language, or something we lack proper conceptual frameworks to interpret remains debated. But the function is clear. Humans are designed as a hybrid, enough divine essence to be intelligent and trainable, enough earthly material to remain mortal and physically limited. The experiment succeeds. Humans multiply. They take over the agricultural labor. The Igi are freed from the work they despised. The crisis is resolved. Except it isn't, because now you have an entirely new category of being. One that reproduces rapidly, that outnumbers the gods within generations, and that fundamentally changes the balance of power in the system. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on 7 tablets and dating to around the 12th century CE, provides a parallel account that adds additional context. This composition frames creation within a larger narrative of divine warfare and political succession. The story begins with primordial chaos, the mingling of fresh water, Apsu and salt water, Tiamat, producing the first generation of gods. These early gods are noisy. They disturb Apsu, who decides to destroy them. But Aya, the Akkadian name for Enki, learns of the plot and kills Apsu first. This triggers retaliation from Tiamat, who raises an army of monsters. The younger gods need a champion to face her. Marduk, Ar's son, volunteers, but only if granted supreme authority. The gods agree and give him the Tablet of Destinies, the symbol of cosmic kingship. Marduk defeats Tiamat, splits her corpse to create heaven and earth, and organizes the cosmos. But then the same problem emerges. Who will do the labor? Marduk's solution mirrors the Atrahasis account. He orders the creation of humans again, using the blood of a slain god. In this version, Kingu Tiamat's second husband and Wale. The text states, "Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage man shall be his name. Truly savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods that they might be at ease." The phrase service of the gods, Ardian Dulu Ilich, is a technical term meaning mandatory labor. Humans aren't created for fellowship or worship or spiritual purposes. They're created to work, to maintain the irrigation systems, to plant barley, to herd sheep, to build temples. The gods want to retire from manual labor, and humans are the solution. This arrangement holds for generations. These Sumerian city-states function as theocratic economies, where the temple of the patron god is the largest landowner and employer. Humans provide labor and offerings. Gods provide protection and guidance through their human representatives, the priests and kings who administer their estates. But then humans become too successful. They multiply beyond control. The cities expand. The noise, that word again, rigmu, becomes unbearable to the gods. And the same council that authorized humanity's creation now authorizes its destruction. This is the context for the flood. It's not divine judgment on human sin. It's not a morality tale about righteousness and wickedness. It's population control gone apocalyptic. The gods created a workforce, lost control of it, and decided to wipe the experiment clean and start over. Enki's opposition to this plan takes on additional meaning when viewed through the labor crisis framework. Humanity wasn't just his creation, they were his solution to a problem that threatened to tear apart the Anunnaki hierarchy. The Igi revolt had nearly triggered civil war. Humanity prevented that. And now Enlil wants to destroy them because they're inconveniently numerous and noisy. From Enki's perspective, if we can reconstruct divine perspective from these texts, this is madness. It solves nothing. If humanity is destroyed, who does the work? Do the return to canal digging? Does that not risk reigniting the rebellion? The flood isn't just mass death. It's throwing away the solution to the crisis that nearly broke the divine hierarchy in the first place. The texts don't explicitly state this reason. Ancient Mesopotamian literature doesn't typically provide internal monologues or psychological explanations. But the pattern is clear. Enki acts to preserve humanity. Enlil acts to destroy them. And the conflict between these two positions isn't theological. It's political and economic. And here's what makes this particularly striking. The labor crisis that sparked humanity's creation isn't unique to one text. References to tensions between the Anunnaki and Ajigi appear across multiple compositions. The hierarchy is stressed, authority is contested, and while humanity's creation temporarily resolved one aspect of the crisis, it introduced new instabilities. Because now humans are numerous enough to be noticed, important enough to matter, and sufficiently aware to question their status. The texts describe human kings, figures like Gilgamesh, part divine himself, who push boundaries, challenge divine prerogatives, and seek immortality that would erase the distinction between mortal and God. The flood doesn't end these tensions, it merely resets the board. And in the aftermath, new conflicts emerge. Conflicts over authority, legitimacy, and the fundamental question of who rules whom, and by what right. The symbol of that authority mentioned repeatedly across Mesopotamian literature is the Tablet of Destinies. Its possession confers supreme power. Its theft represents ultimate rebellion. And according to multiple texts, it was stolen more than once. Each theft marking an escalation in the struggle for control that began with the IG revolt and never fully resolved. Wars for the Tablet of Destinies. In the British Museum's collection sits a stone relief catalogue number, BM124571, originally from the Northwest Palace at Nimrod. The relief dates to the reign of Ashurnasir-Pau, around 865 BCE, but it depicts a much older story. The carved scene shows a winged figure, half man, half eagle, fleeing. Behind him, a god pursues with weapons drawn. Between them, though not depicted in the relief itself, is the reason for this chase. The Tablet of Destinies has been stolen. The relief illustrates one moment from a longer narrative preserved in ununiform texts known as the Anzu epic or the Lugal. Multiple versions exist, spanning Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian recensions over more than 1,000 years. The core story remains consistent. A monster named Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, and the gods must retrieve it to restore cosmic order. But what is this Tablet of Destinies? Why does its theft constitute such an existential crisis? The Sumerian term is Dupnamara, the Akkadian is Tupi-Shimati. Both translate roughly as Tablet of Destinies or Tablet of Fates. Mesopotamian texts describe it as a clay tablet, inscribed with decrees and impressed with cylinder seals. Essentially a permanent legal document. Whoever possesses it holds supreme executive authority. Their commands become reality. The tablet doesn't grant magical power. It grants legitimacy. The right to decree what happens next. This isn't abstract philosophy. In Mesopotamian political culture, written documents sealed with cylinder seals were legally binding. Kings issued decrees on clay tablets. Property transfers required written contracts. Legal judgments were recorded and sealed. Tablet of Destinies functions as the ultimate version of this system, the master document from which all other authority flows. Entum possesses it initially because he was granted supreme authority by Anu after the division of the cosmos. Enki governs the Abzu, the subterranean waters. Enlil governs everything else: air, storms, agriculture, the surface of the earth. The Tablet of Destinies confirms this arrangement. The Anzu epic begins with Anzu serving as doorkeeper to Enlil's throne room. Anzu is described as a massive creature, sometimes depicted as an eagle with a lion's head, sometimes as a storm demon with wing. The text says Anzu watches Enlil bathe and observes where the Tablet of Destinies is kept. He formulates a plan: steal the tablet while Enlil is vulnerable. The theft succeeds. Anzu seizes the tablet and flees to the mountain where he makes his dwelling. With possession of the tablet, he now holds supreme authority. Enlil's commands no longer function. The cosmos grinds to a halt. The text describes the crisis in administrative language. The rites were interrupted. Silence reigned. The gods panic. They need a champion to fight Anzu and recover the tablet. But there's a problem. Anzu now possesses the authority to nullify any attack. He can decree that arrows don't fly, that weapons don't cut, that his enemies are defeated before they strike. The tablet makes him functionally invincible. Several gods refuse the mission. Finally, Ninurta Enlil's son, sometimes called Ningusu, accepts the task. He's the warrior god, associated with both agricultural bounty and military conquest. If anyone can recover the tablet, it's him. The battle itself is described with considerable detail. Ninurta attacks with bow and arrows. Anzu uses the tablet's authority to neutralize them mid-flight. The arrows stop in the air. Ninurta's weapons become useless. The situation is impossible. How do you fight someone who can nullify your attacks by decree? The solution comes from Aya Enki, who advises a specific strategy. Ninurta must shoot not at Anzu directly, but at his wings. The text suggests that severing Anzu's pinions will break his grip on the tablet. Whether this works through physical mechanics or symbolic logic, cutting his wings disrupts his authority isn't entirely clear, but Ninurta follows the advice. His arrows strike true. Anzu's wings are severed. The tablet falls. Ninurta recovers it and returns it to Enlil. Order is restored. Ninurta is rewarded. The cosmos resumes its proper function. Crisis averted. Except the crisis wasn't truly averted. It was merely postponed because the theft of the Tablet of Destinies happens more than once in Mesopotamian literature. Different thieves, different circumstances, but the same fundamental pattern. Someone seizes the symbol of supreme authority. Chaos erupts. A champion fights to recover it, and order is temporarily restored. In the Enuma Elish, the tablet plays a central role in the divine succession crisis. Initially, Anu possesses it. After Ea kills Apsu, authority shifts. Tiamat, seeking revenge, creates an army and elevates Kingu to lead it. She gives Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, effectively making him king. Kingu wears it on his chest as a symbol of his authority. When Marduk defeats Tiamat and her forces, one of his first acts is to take the tablet from Kingu. The text is explicit. From Kingu, who had become chief among them, he took the Tablet of Destinies, not his by right. Marduk then presents the tablet to Anu, who confirms Marduk's new status as king of the gods. Authority has transferred again. The Era Epic, a later composition dating to around the 8th century BCE, describes yet another crisis of authority. This time, Marduk himself abandons Babylon voluntarily, or through deception, depending on how you read the text. Era, the god of plague and warfare, convinces Marduk to leave his throne temporarily. With Marduk absent, Era seizes power and unleashes catastrophe on Mesopotamia. The text describes Era destroying cities, slaughtering populations, and deliberately sowing chaos. His actions aren't random violence, they're strategic. He's demonstrating that with Marduk gone, he can do as he pleases. When Marduk returns and restores order, the damage has already been done. The text functions as a political allegory, but is built on a recurring pattern. When supreme authority is absent or contested, disaster follows. What's striking across all these narratives is that the Tablet of Destinies never stays secure. It's vulnerable, it can be stolen, given away, lost, or taken by force. And each time it changes hands, the cosmos destabilizes. From a mythological perspective, you might read these stories as allegories for natural disasters or seasonal cycles. From an anthropological perspective, they might represent the instability of Bronze Age kingship rulers constantly overthrown, dynasties rising and falling. But if we take the Sumerian framework seriously, if we consider the possibility that these texts preserve historical memory of actual events involving actual beings called Anunnaki, then the Tablet of Destinies represents something more concrete. Perhaps it was a physical object, a master control system, a legal charter, a sealed document granting executive authority over territories and populations. And the repeated thefts weren't cosmic allegories, but political coups. Each theft would represent a challenge to the existing power structure. Anzu's theft challenges Enlil directly, a subordinate seizing authority from his superior. Kingu receiving the tablet from Tiamat represents an older order attempting to reclaim power from the younger gods who killed Apsu. Era's takeover during Marduk's absence represents opportunistic usurpation during a power vacuum. None of these conflicts are resolved permanently. Authority is recovered, but the possibility of future theft remains. The system is inherently unstable because power rests on possession of a physical object that can be taken. And while these thefts occur at the highest levels of divine hierarchy, struggles between major gods over cosmic kingship, other texts described conflicts at different levels. Territorial disputes between cities and their patron deities, conflicts between surface-dwelling and underworld, Anunnaki, and tensions between those gods who favored humanity's survival and those who sought its destruction. One such territorial conflict is preserved in perhaps the most psychologically complex Mesopotamian narrative we possess, Inanna's descent to the underworld. On the surface, it reads as a myth about death and rebirth. But examined within the framework of Anunnaki factional conflict, it becomes something else, a record of open warfare between two branches of the divine family, over jurisdiction and respect, the descent when realms collided. The composition known as Inanna's Descent to the Underworld survives in both Sumerian and Ardean versions. The Sumerian is older, likely composed during the 3rd dynasty of around 2100 CE. The text opens with a statement of intention. From the great above, she opened her ear to the great below. Inanna, queen of heaven and goddess of Uruk, decides to descend into the underworld. The text doesn't explain why. Inanna simply announces she's going. She tells her servant Schubert to alert the other gods if she doesn't return within 3 days. She dresses herself in the regalia of her power crown, lapis necklace, royal robe, breastplate, and more. Each piece is listed specifically. Then she approaches the gates of the underworld. The underworld is governed by Ereshkigal, Inanna's older sister. The relationship between them is strained, hostile even. When Inanna arrives at the outer gate, the gatekeeper Neti informs Ereshkigal of her sister's presence. Ereshkigal's reaction isn't welcoming curiosity. The text describes her as furious, striking her thigh in anger. Nevertheless, Ayskel instructs Neti to admit Inanna, but to enforce the laws of the underworld. These laws are specific and procedural. The underworld has 7 gates. At each gate, Inanna must remove one piece of her divine regalia. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal's throne, she is naked and powerless. The stripping isn't symbolic. Each item Inanna removes represents a specific aspect of her authority. The crown signifies rulership. The lapis necklace represents divine status. The measuring rod and line are tools of judgment. By the 7th gate, she's been reduced from Queen of Heaven to a vulnerable supplicant with no protection and no power. When Inanna finally stands before Ereshkigal, the text becomes chilling. The Anunnaki judges of the underworld fix the eye of death upon her. Inanna dies. Her corpse is hung on a hook like a piece of meat. This isn't metaphorical death. The text treated as physical, final, and humiliating. Inanna, one of the most powerful Anunnaki, has been killed by another Anunnaki in her own realm, and Ereshkigal has no intention of releasing 3 days pass. Nanuba, following Inanna's instructions, goes to the other gods for help. She approaches Enlil first. He refuses, saying Inanna got what she deserved for trespassing. She goes to Nana, the moon god. He also refuses. Finally, she goes to Enki. Enki agrees to help. He creates 2 beings from the dirt under his fingernails. Small sexless creatures called the Kagara and Galator. He gives them the food and water of life, and sends them to the underworld with instructions. Flatter Ereshkigal, gain her trust, and when she offers a reward, ask for Inanna's corpse. The plan works. The creatures descend, offer Ereshkigal sympathy during what the text describes as labor pains, and are rewarded with Inanna's body. They revive her with the food and water of life. But there's a catch. Underworld law requires a replacement. Someone must take Inanna's place. The demons of the underworld, called the Gala, accompany Inanna back to the surface, searching for her substitute. They try to take Nineshub, but Inanna refuses. They try to take her hairdresser and manicurist again. Inanna refuses. Finally they arrive in Uro and find Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, sitting comfortably on her throne in fine clothes, apparently unbothered by her absence. Inanna's rage is immediate. She orders the demons to take Dumuzi. He flees, but eventually he's captured. After negotiation, Dumuzi's sister, Gish-Dinana, volunteers to share his fate. The two will alternate. 6 months in the underworld, 6 months on Earth. The cycle of vegetation, death, and rebirth is thus explained. On one level, this is a seasonal myth. Dumuzi's descent and return correspond to agricultural cycles. Many scholars interpret it purely as allegory for the natural world. But if we strip away the allegorical reading and look at the text procedurally, something else emerges. This is a story about territorial violation and political retaliation between 2 powerful Anunnaki with separate jurisdictions. Ereshkigal governs the underworld. This isn't a punishment. It's her domain established and recognized. Inanna governs Uruk and holds authority over love, warfare, and the planet Venus. These are separate territories with separate powers. The system functions because each respects the boundaries. Inanna's descent violates this arrangement. She doesn't come as a supplicant requesting entry. She demands access. The text explicitly states she threatens to break down the gates if Neti doesn't admit her. This is an aggressive act, essentially an invasion of another god's sovereign territory. Ereshkigal responds by enforcing her laws to the fullest extent. Inanna wanted to enter the underworld in power. Fine, shall be stripped of every symbol of that power, and reminded that in this realm's authority is absolute. The death and hanging aren't murder. They're a demonstration of jurisdictional supremacy. What makes this particularly striking is that multiple gods refuse to help when Nuba asks. Enlil and Nana both essentially say Inanna brought this on herself. They're not neutral, they're siding with Kigal by declining to intervene. Only Enki once again breaks ranks to assist. Why would Enlil and Nana refuse to help one of their own? If the Anunnaki are a unified family working in harmony, why let one of their most important members die in the underworld? The simplest explanation is that Inanna overstepped and the others recognized it. She violated the boundaries of Ishkigal's domain, and they weren't willing to start a conflict with the underworld to rescue her from the consequences. This suggests something crucial about Anunnaki governance. It wasn't centralized. Territories were genuinely independent. Arshagal's authority in the underworld was recognized as absolute even by Enlil. Interfering would set a dangerous precedent. It would imply that surface-dwelling Anunnaki could override underworld authority, which could trigger a broader territorial war. Enki's intervention is thus both a rescue and a violation. He doesn't confront Ereshkigal directly. He can't, because her authority in her domain is legitimate. Instead, he uses trickery, sending creatures small enough and insignificant enough that they don't register as threats until it's too late. When Inanna is revived, she doesn't return to the underworld for vengeance. She doesn't challenge authority. Instead, she complies with underworld law by providing a substitute. The system holds, but barely. The relationship between surface and underworld. Anunnaki has been tested and revealed as fragile. And here's what particularly interesting. This isn't the only text describing conflicts between different realms or territories governed by different Anunnaki. References to boundary disputes, jurisdictional conflicts, and territorial divisions appear throughout Mesopotamian literature. The lament for describes not just human suffering, but divine abandonment. The city's patron god Nana, literally leaving, withdrawing protection, and allowing destruction. The curse of Agard describes Enlil punishing Naram-Sin for violating the temple Eka, which was Enlil's sacred territory. The era epic describes destruction that spreads across multiple cities, suggesting either coordinated attack or cascading failure when one authority collapses. These aren't isolated incidents, they're symptoms of a larger pattern. The Anunnaki system was fracturing. Conflicts that might once have been resolved through council meetings and negotiated settlements were escalating into open hostility. Enki had already defied the council over the flood. Ereshkigal had killed a major goddess and nearly kept her. Various gods had stolen or been given the Tablet of Destinies multiple times. The Igi had revolted and been replaced. And through it all, humanity multiplied and spread across the earth, representing both a solution and a new problem. By around 2000 BCE, according to the archaeological and textual record, something catastrophic happened across Mesopotamia. Multiple cities were destroyed. The Sumerian language ceased to be spoken in daily life, preserved only in scribal schools. Political power shifted. The third dynasty of fell. Akkad vanished so completely that archaeologists still haven't definitively located its ruins. The texts from this period, the lamentation literature, describe the destruction in vivid, troubling detail, and they attribute it not to human armies alone, but to divine decision, divine abandonment, and something the texts call the evil wind. If the Anunnaki conflicts had been building for centuries, and if the flood represented an earlier flashpoint that was survived but not resolved, what would a final confrontation look like? What would happen if the factions that had been maneuvering, competing, and occasionally warring finally reached a point where the conflict could no longer be contained? The answer, according to the texts, begins with one god's decision to protect humanity and the price he was willing to pay to do it. Enki's descent and the secret warning. Enki appears more frequently and more sympathetically in Sumerian literature than almost any other deity except Inanna. He's the god of wisdom, freshwater, crafts, and magic. His temple Anura stood at Eridu, the oldest of the Sumerian cities, and in nearly every major crisis documented in the texts, Enki plays a central role, usually as the figure who defies the consensus to protect humanity. This pattern is so consistent that it can't be coincidence. Where Enlil represents rigid authority and enforcement of divine prerogative, Enki represents flexibility, problem-solving, and often outright subversion of established rules. The composition Enki and Ninmah provides perhaps the clearest illustration of this dynamic. The text begins after humanity's creation, but describes a competition between Enki and the mother goddess Ninmah. They've been drinking beer. The text is explicit about this, and Ninmah challenges Enki. She will create humans with deliberate flaws, and Enki must find a place for each in society. If he cannot, she wins. Ninmah proceeds to create 6 disabled or impaired humans, one unable to hold back urine, one barren, one sexless, and others with various physical limitations. After each creation, Enki finds a role. The incontinent person can be a singer whose constant drinking is acceptable. The barren woman can serve in the women's quarters where fertility isn't required, and so, Enki successfully integrates each of Ninma's failed creations into functional social roles. Then Enki reverses the challenge. He creates a human so damaged it cannot eat, speak or stand, essentially an infant with severe disabilities. He gives it to Ninma and asks her to find its place. She cannot. She admits defeat. The text has troubled scholars precisely because it seems so strange. Why include this episode in the creation narrative? Why focus on disability and social accommodation? But consider what it demonstrates about Enki's character and methods. He's a problem solver who refuses to accept failure as final. Where others see uselessness, he sees potential. Where others want to discard what doesn't work, he finds ways to integrate it. This is who defies the flood decision. This is who saves humanity when the rest of the council votes for extinction. The Eroges preserves his method. Enki cannot override the council's authorization of the flood. The decision has been made, the mechanisms are in motion, and Enlil has supreme authority. But Enki can work around it. He approaches a reed wall, speaks to the wall rather than directly to Zudra, who's on the other side, and accidentally reveals the god's plan within earshot of the human who needs to know. This is cleverness to the point of insubordination. Enki isn't openly defying the council. He's technically complying, while completely undermining the intended outcome. And it works. Zusudra builds the boat. His family survives. Humanity continues. When Enlil discovers the deception, he's enraged, but he doesn't punish Enki. The Atrahasis epic describes a tense confrontation, where Enki essentially argues that complete genocide was excessive, and that more measured population control would have served the same purpose. Enlil accepts this argument, however reluctantly. Why? One possibility: Enki is too powerful to punish without risking open conflict. He governs the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater on which all agriculture depends. Without his cooperation, the irrigation systems that sustain Sumerian civilization would fail. Enlil might have supreme authority, but Enki controls critical infrastructure. Another possibility: other members of the council weren't entirely comfortable with the genocide decision either. Na, who helped create humans, is described weeping during the flood, mourning the deaths. Perhaps Enki's defiance wasn't universally condemned. Perhaps he was doing what others wished they could do, but didn't have the courage to attempt. Either way, the result is the same. Enki successfully protected humanity, and the consequences of that protection rippled forward into every subsequent interaction between gods and humans. Because now humanity owes its continued existence specifically to Enki. Not to Enlil, who wanted them destroyed. Not to Anu, who apparently didn't care enough to intervene. To Enki, who broke ranks to save them. This creates a permanent factional alignment. Enki's sympathies lie with humanity. Enlil's sympathies lie with divine prerogative and order. And every subsequent conflict between gods will have to account for this division. The texts describe Enki establishing what amounts to a patronage relationship with certain human lineages. The kings of Eridu, his cult city, are described as having special access to divine wisdom. The text Inanna and Enki describes Enki getting drunk and giving Inanna the May divine decrees and cultural knowledge that she then brings to Uruk. Enki seems almost careless with divine secrets, repeatedly sharing knowledge and techniques that other gods prefer to keep restricted. Why would he do this? If the Anunnaki are trying to maintain control over humanity, why does Enki keep empowering humans with knowledge and protection? One reading: he genuinely believes humanity deserves to survive and thrive. This would be the sympathetic interpretation: Enki, as a benevolent patron who sees value in his creation. Another reading: he's conducting a long-term political maneuver against Enlil, by strengthening humanity, by making them indispensable, by giving them knowledge that makes them more capable. He's ensuring that any future attempt to destroy them will be even more costly and difficult. He's making humanity his faction, his power base, his leverage in divine politics. Both readings might be true simultaneously. Ancient Mesopotamian thought didn't require motivations to be pure or singular. A god could act from genuine affection and political calculation at the same time. What's undeniable is that Enki's interventions have consequences. When humanity survives the flood, they rebuild, they multiply again, they spread across the land again, and the same problems that led to the flood, decision, overpopulation, noise, resource consumption, re-emerge within generations. By the period around 2000 BCE, Mesopotamia was densely populated and politically complex. The third dynasty of Ur controlled a vast territory, dozens of cities, millions of people, extensive trade networks, and sophisticated bureaucratic systems. The archaeological record shows centralized administration, massive public works projects, and economic integration spanning hundreds of miles. From a human perspective, this represents the pinnacle of Sumerian civilization. From a divine perspective, if we accept the framework the texts present, This represents exactly the situation that led to the flood decision. Humanity has become too numerous, too powerful, too difficult to control, and then suddenly it ended. The third dynasty fell around 2004 CE. The Sumerian language disappeared from daily use. Multiple cities were destroyed or abandoned. The political order collapsed, and the text written in the aftermath. The lamentation literature described not just military defeat, but divine abandonment and catastrophic destruction that went beyond normal warfare. The lament for Sumer and the curse of Agade, and related compositions all describe a similar pattern. The gods withdrew, they abandoned their cities, they allowed or caused devastating destruction. An evil wind is mentioned repeatedly, carrying something that poisoned the land and killed those who breathed it. These aren't vague poetic descriptions, they're specific, consistent across multiple texts, and troublingly detailed. They describe effects that sound environmental, physical, and long-lasting, and they attribute the destruction to divine decision. If the Anunnaki factions had been building toward confrontation for centuries, if Enki's protection of humanity had created a permanent division in their hierarchy, and if humanity had once again reached a population and sophistication that threatened divine control, what would the final phase of conflict look like? The texts suggest it wouldn't be a single battle. It would be a cascade of crisis. Gods abandoning their posts, protective relationships breaking down, and finally deployment of weapons or methods that devastated the land itself. And according to the chronological framework preserved in multiple sources, this happened not in mythological time, but in datable historical time around 20,000 BCE, witnessed, recorded, and lamented by the survivors who wrote it down so it wouldn't be forgotten. What the king list doesn't say. The Sumerian king list is one of the most copied and referenced documents in ancient Mesopotamia. More than 15 surviving versions have been recovered, written at different times and with slight variations, but all following the same basic structure, a chronological record of who ruled, where they ruled, and for how long. The document begins with the phrase, "When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." It then proceeds to list antediluvian kings rulers, who reigned before the flood, followed by the flood itself as a hard chronological divider. Then post-diluvian kings, continuing to the time of the list's composition. The most complete version, the World Blondel Prism, held at Oxford's Asholan Museum, provides the fullest antediluvian section. 8 kings ruled 5 cities, Badira, Laripa, and Shuruppak. Their combined reigns total 2,400 years, or in some versions significantly more depending on how the numerical signs are interpreted. After listing these 8 kings, the text states simply then, "The flood swept over." The next line reads, "After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish." The post-Diluvian section then continues with kings, whose reigns are measured in human scale years, still extraordinary, with some ruling 300 or 400 years, but nothing approaching the antediluvian figures. The list offers no explanation for this shift. It doesn't comment on why antediluvian kings lived tens of thousands of years while post-Diluvian kings lived hundreds. It doesn't explain what kingship lowered from heaven means, or why it needed to be lowered twice, once before the flood, and again after. It simply records the data and moves on. This has frustrated scholars for a century. The astronomical numbers are clearly problematic. No one lives 43,200 years. Various explanations have been proposed. The numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals, or they're encoded in a base 60 system that's been misinterpreted, or they're purely symbolic indicators of legitimacy rather than literal chronology. All of these explanations have merit, but they don't explain why the king list treats these numbers as straightforward data rather than symbolic or mythological information. The list doesn't use mythological language. It doesn't invoke gods or monsters or magical events. It's written in the same administrative style used for grain receipts and tax records. It simply says this king ruled this city for this many years, then that king ruled that city for that many years, and so forth. What if we take it seriously, not as accurate chronology, but as accurate record-keeping? What if the scribes who compiled the king list were working from sources they believed to be reliable, copying information passed down through generations and recording it faithfully, even though the numbers seem impossible? This creates a different question. What would have to be true for these numbers to have been recorded in the first place? One possibility: the antediluvian kings weren't human. If the king list is recording Anunnaki rule, actual gods or long-lived beings governing Sumerian cities before the flood, then the extraordinary lifespans aren't human lifespans. They're divine or semi-divine lifespans, recorded by the Anunnaki themselves, or by human scribes who witnessed them. After the flood, according to this framework, direct divine rule ends. Kingship is lowered from heaven again, but this time it's lowered to human rulers who govern as representatives rather than as gods themselves. The post-Diluvian kings still live longer than modern humans, suggesting perhaps some lingering divine heritage or different environmental conditions, but they're clearly mortal in a way the antediluvian rulers were not. The king list provides a second piece of curious data. After the flood, kingship moves. The antediluvian section sees kingship passing from Eridu to Bad Tabira to Larak to Sippar to Shuripak, a geographical progression within southern Mesopotamia. But after the flood, kingship starts in Kish, far to the north. Then it moves to Uruk, then to Ur, then to Awan, then back to Kish, then to Hamasi, and so forth, bouncing between cities with no clear pattern. This suggests political instability. The antediluvian period, despite its impossibly long reigns, shows orderly succession. The post-Diluvian period shows constant upheaval, dynasties rising and falling, power shifting, no city able to hold supremacy for long. Why this shift? If we accept the framework that antediluvian rule was direct, Anunnaki governance, then the instability makes sense. They're gone, or at least their direct rule has ended. Human kings now compete for power without divine authority, clearly backing any one dynasty. The result is exactly what you'd expect: chaos, warfare, and rapidly shifting political control. The king list documents this, but doesn't explain it. It doesn't say why the Anunnaki stopped ruling directly. It doesn't describe a war or a departure or a decision to withdraw. It simply records that something fundamental changed at the flood, and afterward, the system worked differently. Other texts fill in pieces of this transition. The lament for Suman and Ur describes the gods abandoning their cities. Enlil abandons Nippur. Nana abandons Ur. Enanana abandons Uruk. The text describes this as a deliberate departure, not a military defeat. The gods chose to leave. Why would they leave? After millennia of direct governance, after establishing cities and temples and priesthoods and kingship systems, why abandon everything? The lament texts provide an answer, though a troubling one. The gods themselves authorized the destruction. Enlil decreed it. Anu confirmed it. The divine council decided that Sumer would fall, and then they withdrew, removing their protection, allowing or causing catastrophic destruction to sweep through the land. This sounds remarkably similar to the flood decision. Once again, the gods determined that human civilization has grown beyond acceptable limits. Once again, they authorized destruction, but this time there's no Enki to warn anyone, no Zasudra to build a boat, just systematic abandonment and catastrophe. The key difference is the scale. The flood was meant to wipe out all humanity. The destruction around 2000 BCE was geographically limited to Mesopotamia and temporally limited to a few decades. It wasn't extinction, it was punishment, reordering, or possibly collateral damage from conflicts among the gods themselves. Because here's what the king list and the lament texts don't explicitly state but strongly imply: not all the Anunnaki left. Some cities survived, some dynasties continued. The post-Diluvian king list keeps going. Kingship continues to be lowered from heaven, which suggests some divine involvement continues just in a different form. What if the catastrophe around 2000 BCE wasn't a unified decision by all the Anunnaki, but the final phase of the factional conflict that had been building since the flood? What if some Anunnaki wanted to maintain direct rule, some wanted to withdraw, and some wanted to destroy human civilization entirely? And these competing objectives led to open warfare. The texts don't describe it in those terms. Ancient Mesopotamian literature doesn't typically provide explicit causal analysis or political commentary, but the pattern is there. Prolonged instability in divine hierarchy, repeated conflicts over authority and territory, escalating violence, and finally devastating destruction that changed the fundamental relationship between gods and humans. This composition describes the destruction of Akkad, the capital of Sargon's empire, as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's offense against Enlil's temple. The destruction is catastrophic. The text describes the city cursed, abandoned, and so thoroughly destroyed that later generations couldn't even locate its ruins. Archaeological confirmation of this is remarkable. Akkad has never been found. Despite centuries of searching, despite knowing roughly where it should be, archaeologists have not definitively identified Akkad's location. The city vanished from history so completely that even its physical location was forgotten. The curse of Akkad attributes this to divine wrath. Naram-Sin, the text says, violated the Ekor temple in Nippur, Enlil's sacred precinct. As punishment, Enlil summoned a barbarian horde from the mountains, who destroyed Akkad utterly. The text describes economic collapse, infrastructure failure, famine, disease, and the complete breakdown of order. But here's what's interesting. The text also describes specific environmental effects. It mentions sterile fields, poisoned wells, and land that wouldn't support agriculture for generations. These aren't typical consequences of military invasion. They suggest something more. either deliberately deployed weapons or environmental catastrophe accompanying the destruction. The same environmental language appears in the lament for the city as destroyed, not just by Elamite invaders, but by the storm by fire that consumes everything, by something the text describes as darkening the sky and poisoning the air. Survivors flee not just from soldiers, but from environmental conditions that make the land uninhabitable. If the king list is recording real data, divine rulers before the flood, human rulers after, with the flood marking the transition, then what event around 2000 BCE marked the final transition? When did direct divine governance end completely, and what caused such widespread destruction that it's still documented in text written generations after the fact? The answer might lie in what multiple texts reference, but never fully explain the weapons deployed during the final conflict. The texts don't call them weapons explicitly. They call them storms, winds, fires, and divine decrees, but they describe effects that go beyond anything conventional Bronze Age warfare could produce. And if we take the text seriously as documentary evidence rather than pure mythology, we have to ask, what were the Anunnaki capable of? What technologies or methods did they possess? And what happens when those capabilities are turned against each other or against the human populations caught between them? The catastrophe of 2024 BC. Several ancient sources suggest that a major catastrophe struck the Near East around 2024 BCE, though the exact date varies slightly depending on which chronology you follow. The fall of the Third Dynasty is dated to approximately 2004 CE. By most scholars, the destruction of Akkad falls somewhere between 2000 and 2005 BCE. Geological and archaeological evidence points to widespread urban collapse, population displacement, and environmental stress across Mesopotamia during this period. The Sumerian lamentation texts written in the aftermath describe what they witnessed with disturbing specificity. The lament for Sumer and is among the longest and most detailed. It's preserved in multiple copies from Old Babylonian period sites, meaning it was copied and recopied for centuries after the events it describes. The composition runs over 500 lines organized into 11 sections or songs, each focusing on different aspects of the destruction. The lament begins by establishing that what happened wasn't accidental or the result of ordinary human warfare. The text explicitly states that Enlil, the supreme god, decreed Sumer's destruction. Enlil called the storm, the people mourn, exhilarating winds he took from the land. The people mourn, good winds he took away from Sumer. The people mourn, he summoned evil winds. The people mourn. The word translated as evil winds is imulilos in Sumerian. This phrase appears repeatedly throughout the lament literature. It's not a metaphor for enemy armies. Those are described separately using different terminology. The imhole is treated as a distinct phenomenon, something environmental or atmospheric that accompanied the military destruction but was separate from it. The text describes the effects of this evil wind with clinical precision. It covered the land like a garment. It blanketed the earth like thick cloth. Those exposed to it became sick, livestock died, water sources became contaminated. The text says heads were laid low, bodies were scattered. The storm prostrated the living and the dead alike. This doesn't sound like conventional warfare. Soldiers kill the living, not the dead. A military campaign doesn't prostrate corpses. Something else is being described. Something that affected everything in its path, regardless of whether it was alive or already deceased. The lament continues. The storm ordered by Enlil in hate. The storm that wears away the land, covered like a cloth, wrapped it like a linen garment. The language consistently uses covering, wrapping, blanketing, suggesting something that spreads over an area, rather than moving through it. Further along, the text describes the aftermath. Inside it there is death. Outside it there is death. Inside we die from famine. Outside we die from Elamite weapons. In the weak and the strong perished from hunger. Mothers and fathers who stayed in their houses were overcome by fire. Young and old lying in the street were all overcome by fire. The streets where they strolled lay empty. Note the progression. Death inside from famine. Death outside from enemies. Then fire that overcame people in their houses and in the streets. This is a multi-stage catastrophe, with different mechanisms killing different populations. And the fire is described strangely. It overcomes people. It doesn't burn buildings. They're not fleeing from a configuration. They're dying where they stand or sit. The lament for adds additional detail. On the plain, the grass grew sparse. Dead gods lay scattered. Large trees were uprooted. The birds and wildlife had left. The environmental collapse described here goes beyond immediate battle damage. Grass doesn't become sparse overnight from warfare. Trees aren't uprooted by invading soldiers. Birds and wildlife fleeing in mass suggests environmental contamination or conditions that made the land uninhabitable for extended periods. Most troubling is this passage. The good house was thrown into dust. Dust clouds came from where the good houses had been. The palace built for pleasure was turned into a pitiful place. The people mourn, the people groan, the people make their rounds. Dust clouds from where houses had been, not rubble, dust, as if structures had disintegrated or been pulverized rather than simply demolished. The lament for Sumer and provides an even more comprehensive picture, because it describes not just but multiple cities suffering similar fates. In the people groan. In Akkad, the people groan. In Eridu, the people groan. In Nippur, the people groan. The destruction wasn't localized to one city. It affected the entire region. The text also describes divine abandonment. Enlil let the Elamites enter the great gates. Like a swallow they flew from the city. The gods who ate not the food of that city, who drank not the water of that city. The gods who received not the gifts, who ate not the offerings, who drank not the libations. They went away. They moved to the mountain. The gods evacuated before the destruction. They withdrew to the mountain, whether literal mountains or a metaphorical distant location, and they did so deliberately, refusing the food and offerings that would require them to stay and protect their people. This is described as abandonment, and the text presents it as traumatic betrayal. The Curse of Agad, though focusing on Akkad, specifically uses similar language. It describes Naram-Sin's offense, destroying Enlil's Eka temple, and the punishment that followed. Enlil summoned the Gutians, a mountain people who invaded and devastated the land. But beyond the military invasion, the text describes something else. For the first time since cities were built and founded, the great agricultural fields grew no grain, the flooded fields grew no fish, the irrigated gardens produced neither honey nor wine, the gathered clouds did not rain, the vegetation did not grow. At that time, 1 shekel of oil was only half a quart. 1 shekel of grain was only half a quart. This describes systematic agricultural collapse across the entire region. Grain doesn't grow, fish disappear from flooded fields, gardens produce nothing, rain doesn't fall, vegetation doesn't grow, and the commodity prices at the end indicate economic catastrophe. A shekel normally bought far more than half a quart, suggesting hyperinflation and complete market breakdown. The text continues. The people were bought for half a shekel. A child was bought for a third of a shekel. In those days, the great fields and meadows had no one in charge of them. In those days, no one worked the fields. No one placed a shovel in the fields. No one cared for the irrigation ditches. The fields grew nothing but weeds. This isn't just temporary disruption. This is multi-year or even multi-dead abandonment. Fields don't grow nothing but weeds after a single season of neglect. It takes years for agricultural land to revert to wild vegetation. The text is describing prolonged depopulation and environmental breakdown. Then comes perhaps the most troubling passage. At that time, because of Eka, Enlil cursed Akkad with a terrible curse. City, you who dared assault the Eka, who dared spread your wings over my bird like a snaring net, who devoured offerings from the temple like a savage lion. For this may your canal be filled with earth and no water flow. May your plains that grow grain instead grow only weeds. May that city never rebuild. Let it be as if it never existed. And it worked. Akkad was never rebuilt. Later generations searched for it and couldn't find it. The city that Sargon established that dominated Mesopotamia for over a century simply vanished from the landscape. Archaeological excavations have identified possible locations, but no definitive proof. The curse, whatever it represents, literally or metaphorically, was fulfilled. Now, mainstream scholarship explains all of this in conventional terms. The fall of the third dynasty of is attributed to Elamite invasion from the east. The collapse of Akkad is attributed to internal instability and external pressure from mountain peoples. The environmental descriptions are read as poetic exaggeration or as records of drought and climate change that archaeological and geological evidence confirms affected the region during this period. These explanations hold weight. The Elamites did invade. There was climate disruption around 20200 BCE. Political instability did lead to collapse, but these explanations don't fully account for the specific language in the texts. Why describe the destruction as authorized by Enlil if it was simply a military defeat? Why repeatedly mention the evil wind as distinct from enemy armies? Why describe effects? Dust clouds where buildings stood, corpses and living both prostrated, birds and wildlife fleeing, multi-generational agricultural collapse that go beyond anything conventional warfare produces. If we return to the framework that these texts preserve memory of Anunnaki conflicts, a different picture emerges. What if the catastrophe around 2000 CE wasn't purely human warfare, but included divine warfare? What if weapons or capabilities beyond Bronze Age technology were deployed? The texts don't call them weapons, they don't use explicit technological language, but they describe effects. Widespread environmental contamination, something that blankets an area and kills everything exposed to it, fires that overcome people without burning buildings, land that remains uninhabitable for decades, and cities so thoroughly destroyed that even their locations are forgotten. Alternative researchers have suggested that these descriptions match effects of radioactive fallout or directed energy weapons or some other advanced technology. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as speculative fantasy with no physical evidence. But physical evidence from this period does exist. It's just ambiguous. Archaeological work at multiple sites shows destruction layers from around 2000 BCE. At excavations revealed massive burning and demolition. At Nippur, sections of the city were abandoned and not reoccupied for generations. At sites throughout southern Mesopotamia, the Third Dynasty level shows catastrophic disruption, followed by population decline. Environmental evidence confirms drought and climate stress. Core samples from lakes and seas in the region show evidence of a major aridification event around 2200 D.C. that lasted for centuries. This would explain the agricultural collapse the texts describe. Yet the texts insist this wasn't just climate change. It was divine judgment. They insist the gods authorized this. They withdrew protection, summoned enemies, and deployed evil wind. They describe it in language that separates environmental catastrophe from military invasion, even while acknowledging both were present. If the Anunnaki factions had been moving toward confrontation for centuries, if Enki's protection of humanity had created permanent divisions, if conflicts over the Tablet of Destinies and territorial jurisdiction had repeatedly destabilized their hierarchy, then around 2000 BCE, something brought the tensions to a breaking point. The texts preserve clues about what that might have been. They describe gods abandoning cities, not defeated and forced out, but deliberately choosing to leave. They describe systematic destruction authorized at the highest levels. They describe environmental effects that went beyond normal warfare. And they describe a fundamental shift after this catastrophe. Direct divine rule never fully returned. Human kings ruled human cities, and the Anunnaki, if they remained at all, did so at a distance. What could cause such a radical change? What would make the gods who had governed directly for thousands of years suddenly withdraw? One possibility: they destroyed each other. The final war wasn't gods versus humans, but gods versus gods with humanity caught in the crossfire. The weapons deployed were so devastating that even the victors couldn't remain. The land was too damaged, the cost was too high, and so they left. Another possibility: they were defeated. Some force or faction managed to drive the Anunnaki out entirely. The texts hint at this without stating it explicitly. There are references to divine retreats, to the mountain, to gods fleeing or hiding, to power structures collapsing. A third possibility: they had no choice. Something external forced them to leave. Perhaps a directive from higher authority, a new paw, or environmental conditions that made Earth uninhabitable for them, even if survivable for humans, or a realization that continued presence would lead to mutual destruction. The texts don't provide enough clarity to definitively choose among these options, but they do make clear that what happened around 2000 CEC was catastrophic, multi-layered, and involved divine agency in ways that changed everything that came after. And some of those changes involved specific weapons or phenomena that the text reference repeatedly, objects and forces that seem to have played central roles in the conflicts, but that the literature never fully explains. The Lugali describes Ninurta gathering stones with extraordinary properties after his victory over Anzu. The Era epic describes Marduk possessing weapons that needed to be cleansed and repaired, weapons so dangerous that even preparing them for use caused destruction. The Lament text describe fire that overcomes without burning, and wind that kills without physical force. If we're going to understand what the texts claim happened during the Anunnaki's final conflicts, we need to look more closely at what they say about the capabilities and weapons involved, even if doing so pushes us into territory that mainstream scholarship refuses to seriously consider: the weapons that should not exist. The Lugal-Ea Sumerian composition of over 700 lines describes Ninurta's campaign against a mountain rebellion and his subsequent organization of stones. The text dates to the early 2nd millennia BCE. Though the events it describes are placed in the mythological past, most scholars read it as political allegory or nature poetry, but the specific details are strange enough to warrant closer examination. After defeating the warrior Asag and his stone army, Ninurta the battlefield and encounters various types of stones and minerals. He judges each one, assigning it a fate based on its behavior during the battle. Stones that supported him receive blessings and useful properties. Stones that opposed him receive curses and are rendered useless or dangerous. The list is extensive and oddly specific. Ninurta blesses the Saden stone. You are fit to be used in a fortuning silver and lapis lazuli. He curses the East stone. No one will value you. He addresses the Kinna stone, like a dog that eats its own vomit. like a pig wallowing in its own excrement. You shall never be purified. Some of these stones receive properties that sound technological rather than merely symbolic. The dew stone is blessed to illuminate the darkness. The Algamesh stone is cursed to burn like fire. The EC diorite is blessed for use in making statues and grinding implements. The Haktum stone is assigned to make the waters pure. One passage stands out. Nerta addresses a stone called the Gug. You shall be the stone of the great divine powers, fit for the hand of the Lord. No other stone shall be placed before you. You shall be feared like the god Utu. The Gug stone is described as having properties so valuable and dangerous that special protocols govern its handling. What stones or minerals have properties dangerous enough to require restricted handling? In the Bronze Age, the obvious answer would be toxic minerals, cinnabar, mercury ore, ralgar, arsenic compound, or radioactive minerals like pitchblende. But would the Sumerians have had concepts for radioactivity or chemical toxicity in the modern sense? The text doesn't explain the Go stone's properties. It simply states that it's exceptionally powerful, requires careful handling, and is associated with divine authority. The same vagueness appears throughout the stone. Blessing section effects are described, but mechanisms aren't explained. The Era epic, preserved in multiple copies dating from the 1st millennium BCE, describes a different category of concerning objects, Marduk's weapons. The narrative begins with Era, god of plague and violence, plotting to seize power while Marduk is distracted. Era's advisor Ishim suggests that Marduk's weapons, the city, 7 powerful objects or beings, have become neglected and need maintenance. Era uses this as an opening. He tells Marduk, "Your weapons have become weak. They need to be restored. You must take them to the divine craftsman to be purified and sharpened. Leave your throne temporarily. Go to the place where weapons are renewed." Marduk, troubled by Era's description of his weakened weapons, agrees. He leaves Babylon to have the weapons properly maintained. The text describes this process in language that suggests metallurgical work, heating, hammering, purifying, but also uses terms that don't quite match conventional Bronze Age metal working. While Marduk is absent, Era seizes power and unleashes catastrophe. He destroys cities, slaughter populations, and deliberately creates chaos. The destruction is widespread and excessive. Isham, Era's own advisor, eventually convinces him to stop, pointing out that the devastation has gone too far and will reflect badly on himself. When Marduk returns and sees what happened, he's horrified. The text describes him surveying the damage, mourning the destruction and condemning Era's actions, but the damage is done. Babylon has been devastated, Mesopotamian civilization has been disrupted, and the text makes clear that this wouldn't have happened if Marduk's weapons had been functional. If he hadn't been deceived into leaving them vulnerable to maintenance or theft. What weapons require such careful maintenance that their absence creates a power vacuum? What weapons are dangerous enough that their mere preparation causes collateral destruction? The text doesn't specify. The Sibiti are sometimes described as demons, sometimes as physical objects, sometimes as both simultaneously. They're associated with plague, fire, and storm forces that kill indiscriminately and spread beyond their intended targets. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains another troubling reference. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, they take his radiances or auras. The text uses the Akkadian word melamu, which translates as divine splendor or terrifying radiance. These melamu are described as physical objects that Humbaba wore or possessed. After his death, Gilgamesh distributes them to various gods. The word melamu appears throughout Mesopotamian literature, associated with divine beings and sacred objects. It's consistently described as something visible, radiant, and fear-inducing. Gods possess melamu, and in some context, exposure to melamu without proper protection is dangerous or fatal. Is this metaphorical language for divine authority? Probably in most cases, but the consistency with which the term appears, the descriptions of it as something that can be removed or transferred, and the association with danger suggest it might reference something more concrete, perhaps a technology or phenomenon the Sumerians observed but didn't fully understand. The Lament for Ur describes weapons deployed during the city's destruction in similarly vague but troubling terms. The storm forced the inhabitants to gather in holes. It was the storm that annihilated the great storm from heaven, whose terrifying howl resounded, which destroyed the cities and houses, whose searing heat consumes the land. Searing heat that consumes isn't normal fire. Fire burns. It doesn't radiate heat that consumes things at a distance. The language suggests something like intense thermal radiation, the kind of heat that killed by exposure rather than by direct contact with flame. Another passage from the same text. That day, the storm, the people were afraid, they could not flee. A storm cyclone howled above, below, famine raged, death loomed. The storm's fiery heat scorched the necks of people, made them faint. Heat that scorches necks, specifically that makes people faint before killing them. That comes from above, but doesn't require direct flame contact. This doesn't sound like conventional warfare. It sounds like exposure to intense radiation or directed energy. The curse of a god contains perhaps the most explicit description. The city turned into dust. Birds flew away. Fish floated dead in the water. The land became white with salt. No green thing grew. The water became poison. Even looking at the ruins made people sick. Making people sick just from looking at ruins is extraordinary. Normal battle damage doesn't cause illness from visual exposure, but radioactive contamination or chemical weapons residue could. Salt accumulation suggests either soil poisoning or the result of irrigation system collapse, but the land became white with salt suggests rapid extensive salinization beyond what natural processes produce. The texts consistently describe three phenomena. First, environmental effects that persist long after the immediate destruction. Land remaining uninhabitable, water sources contaminated, vegetation not growing for years or decades. This suggests either severe soil-water contamination or repeated applications of destructive force over extended periods. Second, heat or radiation effects that kill without visible fire, people overcome while sitting in their houses, corpses and living prostrated alike, birds and wildlife fleeing in mass before human populations even recognize danger. This suggests exposure to something invisible that causes immediate physiological distress. Third, materials or objects with dangerous properties requiring special handling. The Gugstone feared like a god, Marduk's weapons requiring specific maintenance protocols, Humbaba's Melamu causing fear and potential harm, the evil wind that spreads like cloth and kills everything it covers. Mainstream scholarship interprets all of this as poetic language describing normal ancient warfare, natural disasters, and the psychological impact of military defeat. Cities burned, people died, survivors traumatized by the experience recorded their memories in heightened metaphorical language. Drought and climate change made the land less productive. Enemy invasions disrupted society. The text preserve these memories, but filter them through mythological frameworks that attribute agency to gods, rather than acknowledging purely human or natural causation. This reading is entirely defensible and probably correct from a conventional historical perspective. But if we entertain the alternative framework that the Anunnaki were real entities with capabilities beyond Bronze Age technology, and that these texts preserve documentation of conflicts involving those capabilities, then the language takes on different significance. The descriptions would represent attempts by Bronze Age scribes to document phenomena they witnessed but couldn't fully explain. They didn't have vocabulary for radiation, chemical contamination, or directed energy. They described what they saw in terms available to them. Divine fire, evil wind, searing heat from heaven, stones with dangerous properties, weapons that required special maintenance. The consistency of descriptions across multiple texts from different time periods and locations suggests these weren't individual inventions, but recurring observations. The evil wind appears in the lament for Sumer, and the curse of Agadi, and references in other composition. The concept of stones with special properties appears in the Lugal and, in technical texts about minerals. References to dangerous divine weapons appear in the Era epic, the Anzu epic, Gilgamesh and other narratives. If these describe real phenomena, the implications are staggering. It would mean the Anunnaki possessed technology or capabilities significantly more advanced than Bronze Age humans. It would mean their conflicts involved weapons that produced effects we would associate with modern or futuristic warfare, thermal radiation, area effect contamination, environmental destruction lasting decades. And it would mean that around 2000.CE, these weapons were deployed extensively enough to devastate multiple cities across Mesopotamia, to poison land and water, to cause environmental collapse, and to force divine and human populations to evacuate affected areas. The texts themselves can't prove this interpretation. They're ambiguous enough to support multiple readings, but they're also specific enough that dismissing them entirely as pure fantasy requires ignoring consistent patterns across dozens of independent sources. What we can say with certainty is that something catastrophic happened around 2000 by D.CE. Cities fell, civilization collapsed, the environment became hostile, populations declined, and the survivors who recorded what they witnessed used language that, whether metaphorical or literal, consistently described effects beyond anything conventional Bronze Age warfare should produce. They also recorded something else: predictions, systems for interpreting signs and forecasting future disasters. And some of these records, only recently deciphered, add another layer to our understanding of what the Mesopotamians believed was coming, or what they remembered had already happened, the omens they left behind. In 2024, researchers announced the translation of a set of ununiform tablets that had sat in museum storage for over a century. The 4 tablets originating from the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE are catalogue indexed at the British Museum as part of the SIPA collection. They contain omen texts, specifically predictions based on lunar eclipse observations. Omen literature is well known in Mesopotamian studies. The ancient scribes believed that celestial events, animal behavior, birth defects, and unusual occurrences could predict future events. Massive compendia of omens were compiled. If X happens, then Y will follow. These texts formed a major component of Mesopotamian scholarship and were copied and studied for over 2,000 years. The newly translated tablets are significant because they focus exclusively on lunar eclipses and their predicted consequences. The format is consistent. If an eclipse occurs in specific month and specific astronomical details, then specific disaster will follow. The predictions are not optimistic. Nearly every entry predicts catastrophe. A king will die, a city will be destroyed, plague will come, the land of Elam will be destroyed, a dynasty will end, the harvest will fail. One entry reads, if an eclipse becomes obscured from its center all at once and clear all at once, a king will die, destruction of Elam. Another, if an eclipse begins in the south and then clears in the north, downfall of Sububatu and Akkad. A third, if an eclipse occurs on the 14th day, the king will die and rain will devastate the land. The specificity is notable. These aren't vague prophecies. They name specific regions. Elam, Akkad, Subatu, specific months, specific eclipse characteristics, and specific outcomes. The tablets read like disaster prediction manuals, suggesting that the Babylonian scholars who compiled them believed eclipses reliably preceded major catastrophes. Why would they believe this? The standard explanation is that eclipses were frightening celestial events that ancient peoples didn't understand, so they associated them with divine anger and predicted disasters as a form of religious interpretation. But that explanation doesn't account for the specificity or the fact that these omen compendia were maintained and refined for millennia. If the predictions never came true, why continue the system? The omen text weren't religious mythology. They were technical documents used by professional scribes and divers who advised kings on policy decisions. If the system didn't work, it would have been abandoned. One possibility, the predictions were self-fulfilling. Kings who heard eclipse omens, predicting their death, might make poor decisions out of fear, leading to outcomes that confirmed the prediction. Or rival factions might use eclipse omens as justification for rebellion or assassination, creating the predicted disasters. Another possibility, the omens were pattern recognition from historical data. If major disasters had genuinely occurred following certain types of eclipses in the past, then predicting similar outcomes for similar eclipses would be rational, not magical thinking, but empirical observation of correlations. If catastrophic conflicts among the Anunnaki had actually occurred, and if those conflicts had been preceded by celestial events, whether coincidentally or because the Anunnaki timed their actions according to astronomical cycles, then subsequent generations would notice the correlation. Eclipse patterns that preceded previous disasters would be treated as warning signs of similar future disasters. The omen texts would then represent historical memory encoded as predictive systems. The scribes weren't inventing associations between eclipses and catastrophes. They were recording patterns observed across centuries of data. This framework would explain the extraordinary consistency and longevity of Mesopotamian omen literature. The Great Omen series Enuma Anu Enli, containing over 7,000 omens organized into 70 tablets, was maintained from the Old Babylonian period through the end of Cuneiform civilization, nearly 2,000 years of continuous copying, study, and refinement. If these were just superstitions, why invest such enormous scholarly effort for so long? But if they represented legitimate pattern recognition from historical disaster data, even if the mechanisms weren't understood, then the investment makes sense. The newly translated eclipse omen tablets add specific detail to what earlier generations believed they had learned. Certain eclipse patterns preceded the king will die events. Other patterns preceded citywide destruction. Still others preceded regional catastrophes affecting multiple territories. Were they right? Did eclipses actually predict disasters, or was this confirmation bias and selective memory? We don't have enough historical data to test the correlations. We know major disasters occurred. The fall of the collapse of Akkad, the destructions described in the lament texts. We know eclipses occurred throughout this period. They're predictable astronomical events, but we don't have precise enough dating for most Bronze Age events to correlate specific eclipses with specific disasters. What we do have is evidence that the Mesopotamians themselves believed the correlation was real, invested enormous resources into tracking it, and developed sophisticated astronomical observation systems specifically to predict eclipses and interpret their implication. The more Lapan tablets, dating to around 1000 EO.CE, but containing early material document, detailed astronomical knowledge, including eclipse prediction methods, planetary positions and star catalogues. The Babylonians could predict lunar eclipses with reasonable accuracy centuries before the Greeks. They tracked these events not for abstract scientific interest, but for practical omen interpretation to warn kings of dangers and to time important decisions. If the Anunnaki conflicts had left survivors with traumatic memories of catastrophic destruction preceded by celestial signs, those survivors would absolutely develop systems to watch for similar signs in the future. The omen texts would represent institutional paranoia based on historical experience. It happened before when we saw X in the sky, so we watch for X to warn us if it might happen again. The fact that major catastrophes stopped occurring after around 2000 CE, or at least stopped occurring at the scale and with the characteristics described in the lament texts, might explain why the omen system gradually became less urgent by the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods. Omen texts were still copied and studied, but they were scholarly exercises preserving ancient learning rather than active disaster prediction systems facing imminent threats. The disasters they warned against, divine abandonment, evil winds, cities reduced to dust, land becoming uninhabitable, had become historical memories rather than present dangers. The Anunnaki wars, if they happened, were over. The omens remained as reminders, as warning systems for threats that no longer manifested, as institutional memory of a time when the sky really did herald catastrophe. But here's what we can't ignore. The omen texts exist. The eclipse tablets predicting destruction exist. The astronomical observation systems tracking celestial events exist. And they all cohere around a central claim that previous generations witnessed correlations between sky events and terrestrial catastrophes, severe enough that subsequent generations built elaborate systems to watch for repetition. Whether those catastrophes were purely human and natural, or whether they involved conflicts among technologically advanced Anunnaki, the fact remains something happened that was severe enough to traumatize Mesopotamian civilization for millennia afterward. And the texts describing those events when read together rather than in isolation tell a surprisingly coherent story, if you're willing to consider that story as something more than pure mythology. 3 interpretations of a final war. We've examined the tablets. We've looked at the flood decision and Enki's descent. We've traced the theft of the Tablet of Destinies through multiple narratives. We followed territorial conflicts from Inanna's descent to the underworld to the gods abandoning their cities around 2000 BCE. We've catalogued references to weapons and phenomena that seem to exceed Bronze Age capabilities, and we've noted the omen systems suggesting previous generations witnessed catastrophic events they desperately wanted to predict and prevent from recurring. Now we face the question, what does all this evidence actually mean? 3 major interpretations present themselves, each with merits and limitations. Interpretation 1, pure mythology and symbolism. The mainstream scholarly consensus reads these texts as mythology serving theological, political, and psychological functions, rather than historical documentation. In this reading, the Anunnaki represent natural forces and political power personified as deities. The flood narrative explains geological evidence of ancient flooding and provides theological justification for human mortality and suffering. The conflicts between gods represent political tensions between city-states and their competing patron deities. When and Uruk fought, the scribes described it as conflict between Nana and Inanna. The Tablet of Destinies represents political legitimacy. Its repeated theft symbolizes dynastic instability and the constant threat of usurpation in Bronze Age kingdoms. The weapons with impossible properties are poetic exaggeration of normal warfare, amplified by trauma and the need to explain devastating defeats as divine judgment rather than military weakness. The environmental descriptions in lament texts document real drought and climate change around 2000 and 2000 BCE, but filtered through religious interpretations that attributed natural disasters to divine anger. The evil wind was probably dust storms, famine, and disease following ecological collapse, not anything supernatural or technological. The omen texts represent early attempts at pattern recognition and predictive systems, mixing real astronomical observation with confirmation bias and the human tendency to find meaning in coincidence. They persisted because they were institutionally embedded, not because they worked. In this framework, the Anunnaki's final war is metaphor for Bronze Age collapse, the systemic failure of political, economic, and environmental systems around 2000 CE that ended Sumerian civilization and forced cultural transformation. The gods abandoning their cities means the political and religious institutions failed. The texts preserve traumatic cultural memory but they're not describing literal divine beings or advanced technology. This interpretation has the weight of mainstream scholarship behind it. It requires no assumptions beyond what we already know about Bronze Age societies, religious mythology, and human psychology. It's coherent, defensible, and probably correct from a conventional historical perspective, but it requires reading virtually every specific detail in the texts as metaphorical. The gods aren't real beings, they're personifications. The weapons aren't real objects, they're poetic amplification. The catastrophes aren't unique events, they're normal warfare and climate change described in heightened religious language. The omen systems aren't based on real correlations, they're superstition. This isn't impossible. Mythology does exactly this. It takes real events and human experiences and encodes them in narrative frameworks featuring supernatural actors, but it does require assuming that nearly everything the texts describe didn't happen as described. Interpretation 2. Encoded wisdom and esoteric knowledge. A middle position reads the texts as containing legitimate ancient knowledge, but encoded in symbolic language for preservation and restricted access. In this reading, the Anunnaki represent real knowledge about cosmic principles, natural laws or psychological processes. The flood narrative encodes information about cyclical catastrophes and how to survive them. The conflicts between gods represent opposed principles, chaos versus order, innovation versus tradition, centralized authority versus distributed power. The Tablet of Destinies represents understanding of how reality operates. Whoever possesses true knowledge of cosmic law can shape outcomes. Its theft represents the danger of knowledge falling into unwise hands. The weapons represent understanding of forces that can both create and destroy. Agricultural knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, all of which have constructive and destructive application. The environmental descriptions preserve knowledge about ecological collapse, showing what happens when natural systems are pushed too far. The texts function as warning literature. This is what happened when balance was lost. Don't repeat these mistakes. The omen systems represent sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded in predictive frameworks. The correlation between celestial events and terrestrial disasters reflects real understanding of solar and lunar cycles affecting weather, agriculture, and human behavior. Not magical causation, but genuine environmental science. In this framework, the Anunnaki's final war represents the consequences of lost balance, ecological, political, psychological, or spiritual. The texts aren't describing literal battles between gods, but encoding lessons about what happens when complementary forces become adversarial, when cooperation breaks down into conflict, when systems designed for harmony tear themselves apart through internal contradiction. This interpretation has appeal because it takes the text seriously while avoiding literal supernatural claims. It suggests ancient Mesopotamians were sophisticated thinkers, encoding genuine knowledge in narrative form. It explains why the texts were preserved so carefully. They contain valuable information worth transmitting across generations. But it requires assuming the texts are deliberately esoteric, that their surface meaning is intentionally misleading, and that their real value lies in symbolic interpretations. We must decode. This puts modern interpreters in the position of claiming to understand meanings that texts never explicitly state, a methodology vulnerable to projection and confirmation bias. Interpretation. 3. Historical documentation of actual events. The alternative framework takes the text at closer to face value. They document real events involving real entities, called Anunnaki, who governed Sumerian civilization before and after the flood, whose internal conflicts escalated over centuries, and whose final confrontations around 2000 BCE were catastrophic enough to end their direct rule. In this reading, the Anunnaki were physical beings, whether advanced humans, long-lived hominids, extraterrestrial visitors, or something else entirely. They possessed technology significantly beyond Bronze Age capabilities. They established the first Mesopotamian city. They genetically modified or culturally uplifted Homo sapiens into civilization. They ruled directly for millennia. The flood was a real global or regional catastrophe that the Anunnaki Council authorized, but the Enki undermined, preserving human lineages. This created permanent factional division, those who accepted humanity's survival, and those who resented it. The Tablet of Destinies was a real object, conferring authority through technological or administrative control, perhaps a physical control system, a genetic key, a master access code, or a document of legitimacy that other Anunnaki recognized and deferred to. The conflicts describe actual political crises and territorial disputes among Anunnaki factions with different agendas. Inanna really did invade Archigall's territory and was killed, rescued through Enki's intervention. Anzu really did steal authority symbols from Enlil and had to be defeated militarily. Ira really did seize power when Marduk was vulnerable. The weapons and environmental effects documented in lament texts represent technologies we don't fully understand. possibly nuclear, radiological, biological, or based on principles we haven't discovered. The descriptions match effects of advanced weapons, not because scribes were prescient or coincidentally accurate, but because they were documenting what they witnessed. The catastrophe around 2000 CE was the final phase of Anunnaki civil war. Factions loyal to Enlil, favoring human reduction, fought factions loyal to Enki, favoring human preservation. The conflict escalated to deployment of devastating weapons. The victors were Pyrrhic, the land was too damaged, the cost too high, the divisions too deep to continue direct rule. The Anunnaki withdrew, leaving humanity to govern itself. The omen systems preserve knowledge that previous catastrophes had been preceded by celestial signs, either because the Anunnaki timed military operations according to astronomical cycles, or because cosmic events affected Anunnaki capabilities or psychology, or simply by coincidence that was noticed and recorded. This interpretation requires accepting that technologically advanced non-human or semi-human entities governed early Mesopotamia, that they possessed capabilities we would consider advanced or miraculous, that they fought wars using those capabilities, and that Bronze Age texts preserve accurate documentation of these events. Even though mainstream archaeology and history reject this framework entirely, the evidence supporting this interpretation is circumstantial. The texts say these things happened. Archaeological evidence shows catastrophic destruction in the right time period, and some textual descriptions sound more like advanced technology than Bronze Age capabilities. But circumstantial evidence isn't proof. The texts could be accurate about events while being wrong about causes. The catastrophes could have been purely human and natural despite religious attributions to divine agency. This interpretation is favored by alternative researchers and rejected by mainstream scholarship as pseudo-history lacking physical evidence and requiring assumptions not supported by the broader archaeological record. Which interpretation is correct? The honest answer: we don't know. Each framework makes sense internally. Each explains the textual evidence according to its own assumptions, and each has limitations. The mythological interpretation requires reading virtually everything as symbolic, which might underestimate Bronze Age people's descriptive accuracy. The esoteric interpretation requires assuming hidden meanings the texts never explicitly claim to contain, which might overestimate Bronze Age people's deliberate encoding of abstract knowledge. The literalist interpretation requires assuming capabilities and events for which physical evidence is absent or ambiguous, which might overestimate the text's factual accuracy and underestimate their theological and political biases. What we can say with confidence: the texts exist. They describe divine conflicts escalating over centuries. They document catastrophic destruction around 2000 CE. They preserve consistent patterns across multiple independent sources. They were taken seriously enough that copies were made for over 1,000 years, and they describe a system of divine governance that fractured, collapsed, and ended during datable historical periods. Whether that system was metaphorical, symbolic, or literal, it changed. The third dynasty fell. Sumerian language died. Political power reorganized. Direct temple-based, theocratic governance gave way to more secular kingship models. Something fundamental shifted in how Mesopotamian civilization operated. The texts attribute this shift to divine decision. The gods chose to withdraw. They abandoned their cities. They stopped intervening directly in human affairs. And after around 2000 CE, the relationship between divine and human governance became more distant, more mediated through ritual, and less through direct presence. If the Anunnaki were real entities, they left. If they were metaphors for political systems, those systems collapsed. If they were encoded knowledge, that knowledge became less accessible. Regardless of interpretation, the text document transition from one era to another, marked by catastrophic destruction and permanent change. And they preserve that documentation so insistently, so specifically, and so consistently, that future generations, including us, would know something happened, something that mattered, something that shouldn't be forgotten. The silence that followed. Return with me to that climate-controlled vault beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The tablet sits in its archival housing. The same temperature, the same humidity as when we first encountered it. CBS 1063. Fragments of the Iridogenesis preserved for 3,600 years. But now you've seen it in context, not as an isolated curiosity, but as one piece in a much larger archive. Thousands of tablets spread across dozens of museums, all telling parts of the same story. A story about gods who ruled directly, who fought among themselves, whose conflicts escalated until around 2000 BCE. Something catastrophic happened that changed everything. The archaeological record confirms the change. After the third dynasty had collapsed, Mesopotamian civilization rebuilt, but differently. Cities remained, but political structures reorganized. Sumerian ceased being spoken, preserved only by scribes in schools. New dynasties rose: Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, but none claimed direct divine kingship in quite the same way the earlier Sumerian kings had. The gods remained in the religious literature. Temples still stood, priests still performed rituals, but the quality of divine interaction had changed. The gods no longer walked among humans. They no longer ruled cities directly. They became more distant, more abstract, more symbolic. Later, Mesopotamian texts acknowledged this shift. Prayers from the first millennium BCE often lament divine absence. "How long, O gods, will you remain angry? How long will you hide your faces?" The tone is different from earlier literature. These aren't texts describing gods who are actively present but disagreeable. They're texts describing gods who have withdrawn, who might return, but currently aren't here. From a mythological perspective, this represents theological evolution. Gods becoming more transcendent, more universal, less tied to specific locations. From a historical perspective, it represents the end of Bronze Age, theocratic city-states, and the rise of larger, more secular empires. From the alternative perspective, if we take the text claims seriously, it represents exactly what they say it represents. The Anunnaki left. They stopped ruling directly. Whether they were defeated, exhausted, mutually destroyed, recalled by higher authority, or simply chose to withdraw, the result was the same. Humanity was on its own. The texts don't celebrate this development. The Lamentations mourn divine abandonment. They describe it as trauma, as loss, as world-ending catastrophe. From the Sumerian perspective, losing direct divine governance wasn't liberation. It was terrifying. It meant vulnerability, uncertainty, the burden of self-rule without divine guidance. And yet, humanity survived, rebuilt, adapted. The post-2000 BCE Mesopotamian civilizations were arguably more sophisticated than their Sumerian predecessors. Babylonian mathematics, Assyrian library systems, astronomical observations, legal codes, all flourished in the centuries after the gods supposedly withdrew. Perhaps that's the real story these tablets preserve. Not just accounts of divine conflicts and catastrophes, but evidence that humanity could function independently, that we could survive the end of direct divine rule, that whatever the Anunnaki were, gods, aliens, metaphors, or misunderstood Bronze Age power structures, their departure didn't end civilization. It transformed it. The king list entries after 2000 CE continue to record kings, dynasties, reigns, but the tone is different. These are human rulers, clearly mortal with documented genealogies and realistic lifespans. The connection to divine authority becomes more attenuated. Kings claim divine favor, divine selection, but not divine parentage or impossibly long lives. The flood had been survived. The catastrophe of 2000 CE had been survived, and afterward, no comparable catastrophe manifested. The omen texts kept predicting doom, kept watching eclipses for signs of returning disaster. But the disasters at the scale of the Lamentations didn't recur either. The Anunnaki Wars really did end around 2000 BC, with survivors withdrawing and conflicts ceasing, or the confluence of factors that produced Bronze Age collapse. Climate change, political instability, migration, warfare resolved itself through societal transformation rather than total extinction. The texts were copied and studied for another 2000 years after the events they describe. Generation after generation of scribes learned ununiform by copying the Erudigenesis, the Atrahasis, the lament, for they preserved these narratives not as ancient history that no longer mattered, but as foundational literature that explained where they came from and what had happened to bring their world into being. The last ununiform tablets were written in the 1st century of the Common Era. By then, Mesopotamian civilization had endured for over 3,000 years since the catastrophes of 2000 CEE. The Anunnaki, whether real or mythological, had been absent for that entire span. Their wars, if they happened, were ancient memory. Their cities were ruins. Their names survived only in scholarly texts and religious traditions. But the documentation survived. The tablets endured, and they waited in the earth for millennia, until archaeologists starting in the 1840s excavated them, translated them, and made them accessible to modern analysis. We still don't know what really happened. We can read the text 3 ways, and each reading makes sense according to its assumptions. We can examine the archaeological evidence, and it supports catastrophic disruption around 2000 CE, without definitively explaining cause. What we cannot do is dismiss the texts as meaningless. They're too consistent, too specific, too carefully preserved across too many centuries to be random invention. They document something, whether literal events, encoded knowledge, or cultural memory of transformative trauma, and they ask us questions. What if civilization wasn't invented, but restored? What if the knowledge that produced Sumerian culture so suddenly didn't develop gradually, but was transmitted from predecessors we've forgotten or never properly recognized? What if the gods were real? Not supernatural necessarily, but physical entities with capabilities we don't possess, motivations we can't fully understand, and histories recorded imperfectly in text written by humans trying to document things they witnessed but couldn't fully explain? What if the wars described weren't allegories, but actual conflicts fought with technologies that seemed miraculous to Bronze Age observers, devastating enough that their effects lingered for centuries and traumatized entire civilizations into creating warning systems so it would never happen again? Or what if none of that is true? But the texts still matter because they show us how ancient peoples understood catastrophe, how they coped with societal collapse, how they preserve memory across generations, and how they constructed meaning from trauma. All of these questions are worth asking. None have definitive answers. The tablets sit in their vaults, the wedge marks pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago, waiting for translators, waiting for archaeologists, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. You've listened to one interpretation of what they might mean, one way of reading the patterns, one framework for understanding why the Sumerians would write so insistently, so specifically, so consistently, about gods who fought, who deployed terrible weapons, who destroyed cities, and who finally withdrew, leaving humanity to govern itself. Whether you choose to read these texts as mythology, as encoded wisdom, or as historical documentation of events that mainstream scholarship hasn't accepted, that choice is yours. The evidence has been presented, the patterns are there, the translations are available, the tablets exist. The Anunnaki's final war, if it happened, ended 4,000 years ago. The weapons are gone, the combatants have vanished, the cities they destroyed are dust, the land has healed. The gods, whether they were ever real, are silent now, but the memory remains, pressed into clay, preserved in vaults, waiting to be read by anyone willing to look closely enough, question carefully enough, and consider seriously enough what these ancient voices were trying so desperately to tell us. The story doesn't end, it just becomes your decision how to interpret it, what to do with it, whether to file it away as interesting mythology, or whether to let it reshape how you understand where we came from, and what might have happened in those distant centuries when gods walked among humans, and the outcome of their conflicts determined whether our species would survive. The texts have spoken, the evidence has been examined, the mystery remains open, and perhaps that's exactly as it should.